an hour can stretch to an hour and 40 minutes only in Bangalore. My complete empathies. Well, I actually had a series of stories to tell you. Now, I don't know what the usual format of these sessions are, but we can definitely have a lot of Q&A. But I'll tell you the areas where I did want to tell you some stories. One is, of course, the pandemic and how we've come out of it, why repeatedly we are being forecasted to be the fastest growing major economy, despite a lot of hiccups. So that was first part of the story, the pandemic and the economy story. Second, I do want to focus on what is likely to be a future engine of growth, which is the healthcare sector, and why globally it is positioned to do for us, for India, what IT sector did in the last 30 years, 35 years. I very strongly believe health is going to do that in the next 50 to 60 years. So the healthcare, strategically why it's of importance to us. I did want to also talk a little bit about labor markets, because you read a lot about it. Jobless growth is becoming a sort of a narrative. And I did want to get into the details of what exactly are the challenges. What does the labor market in India look like? And then a little bit I wanted to talk to you about, there is a new emerging area in economics. It's largely motivated from corporate finance. We call it the narrative economics, and why countries are shaping narratives, and in many ways why it remains a huge challenge for democracies at large, but for us in particular. In India, telling our own stories is still not something we do a very good job of, and hence we are often late to the game, and we're always doing a catch-up game, which does have very direct impact on economies, and the real economy in particular. So those are broadly the kind of, I had a deck of slides, you can imagine. I almost always have a lot of data to show you, but I think we couldn't get the slides on, but we'll definitely, one thing I could do is, Rajesh, Rajesh, if we can share those slides with everyone. Just take a look at it. In fact, many times the data is so compelling that when you look at a slide, you know what the story is. So let's start off by the pandemic. Let us, we are, I believe, at the fag end of it. When it had started, then just reading the literature. Now, I'm an economist. In never will an economist say we are trying to get into the epidemiology space. Some believe epidemiologists were created to make economists look better. Just like we say, astrologers were meant to make, or economists were meant to make astrologers look better. But the pandemic has been very humbling. It has been humbling because it has taught us a lot. From the economic perspective, in fact, the first set of data points that I want to bring to your notice is, in the first quarter of the pandemic, we suffered the most. In fact, our decline in GDP was one of the biggest globally. That we recovered, yes, we did. But the fact that we had almost a 24% decline in the first quarter is telling in itself. And it's a bit of an anomaly from the usual trend, because globally, if you just look at all countries, how many deaths happened from the pandemic and what was the GDP decline, because it tells you how severe was the pandemic and therefore how bad was the economic decline. Those are two things you want to correlate and understand. Then countries can be bunched into two halves. There are countries which had a lot of deaths and very high GDP decline. A lot of the OECD countries fall in that category. The rich countries, particularly Western European countries, had a lot of deaths, and the economic decline was very severe. And then you have a bunch which is very few deaths, but significant variation in decline, and we are one of those very few, along with Philippines, etc., which had relatively few deaths. And few deaths, I mean not absolute terms. Absolute in India is always very large, but that's not. In per capita, if you even look at per million population, our deaths are relatively few. But the economic decline was very large. And so that becomes an anomaly in itself, that why did we suffer such a big decline? And that again tells you about the opportunity cost of not having strong public health infrastructure. We were the first country to go in for a lockdown with the total number of less than 500 cases. So we truly went in for a preemptive lockdown. And of course, in hindsight, we can say it was a pragmatic response, but at that point, it was the only response one could take. Because if you remember the forecasts we were getting, we were going to see hundreds of millions of people get infected, and we were going to see millions of deaths in the first wave itself. So that was the prediction. Given that we didn't have infrastructure, in fact, 7 states of India did not have ICMR-approved testing laboratories. So forget about cure, you did not even have enough infrastructure to test for COVID. We didn't have enough masks. Vaccines were still a far cry. And against that, the preemptive lockdown, in hindsight, seems like the right response today. And of course, the deaths overall remained low because the first wave was very muted, but the real cost was very high. We suffered a very large decline in GDP. So the lesson of that story is we paid a price for not having adequate health infrastructure. Not because the pandemic itself was very bad for us, but just that we didn't have adequate health infrastructure. Of course, it bought us time. So in the process, then you very quickly, almost every district of the country, I think we have around 740 districts or so, were able to bolster the bed capacity, were able to bolster testing labs, etc., etc. And of course, then the rest of it is a story which we know commonly. One thing which often belies a lot of fundamental narratives you hear globally is for a resource-poor country. Now, most of the news when you watch or when you pick up good journals or newspapers, the story about India's COVID experience is quite traumatic. And yet, if you consider the fact that we are a resource-poor economy, we should not be comparing with the OECD. We should be comparing with perhaps the likes of Brazil. Even that is on the higher side. For a resource-poor country to come out of COVID at the speed, in the sense the vaccination drive, within 9 months we had crossed 1 billion doses. We are one of the very few countries globally which manufactures and develops vaccine. Only G7. In fact, you really have only the leading economic powers that develop and manufacture. So while we were pharmacy to the world, because 70% vaccines do go out from India, the technology sharing arrangement, and thankfully we did have entrepreneurs and businesses like the Serum Institute, etc., who did take a bet on the technology. And in hindsight, all of that worked to our favor. And of course, we did have the Bharat Biotech and so on and so forth. Subsequently, a lot of joint ventures. But one thing that at the end, if you saw in 2 years, even after technology was available, that Corona very quickly turned into a very typical political economy struggle in the world. It was between the North and the South, the rich and the poor, because technology transfer, despite all efforts of WHO, despite efforts of the UN, despite efforts of most multilateral institutions, the technology transfers, the kind of waiving of IPR, etc., which was expected and which was promoted and lobbied very strongly for, did not happen. Right? So, in fact, for those who have been following a lot of this from the AIDS time, the AIDS technology, a lot of the treatment and the vaccines existed, but again, the story is repeated. In fact, it's the same story which gets repeated again and again, that despite the know-how existing in the world, you saw very large number of deaths from AIDS in Africa, but the US was able to curtail it because they had the technology. So transferring of technology on a real-time basis against a global crisis is not happening even now, which then leads to the issue of the kind of pressures multilateral institutions are under today. And this is where, the role of WHO, the future of WHO, the funding of WHO, all of those concerns. For us, WHO is a very important body, despite China's influence, just like most other multilateral institutions are. And from the international relations story, we call it rules-based order. We fundamentally believe in it because it has worked to our advantage till now, number one. Number two, we don't have the technical capabilities in-house to manage a lot of these things. So we need these institutions. We can't junk them. So the popular narrative is WHO failed, just like WTO failed against China. And so the alternative is much worse. So we need to invest, and India is investing. Next year is G20 India's presidency. So there is an entire sort of manifesto and an agenda which is unfolding. And in that regard, I think businesses have a very large role to play. That conversation has very much stayed in Delhi. But I think businesses must be part of that conversation. You must be actively shaping what India's presidency of the G20 should mandate. What should it really aspire towards? Because right now it very much remains within the larger realm of governance. And we talk about development concepts. But I think a lot of these things become sustainable when you have these relationships across businesses, across countries, across member countries, and so on. So one issue is I urge networks like these that you must get involved in these conversations. Otherwise, it's not sustainable if it remains within the realm of government. But anyway, the reason the IMF or almost all forecast for Indian growth remains very high is on the back of very rapid vaccination. And one, of course, the nature of the virus itself, right? The subsequent, after the Delta wave, the subsequent waves have been relatively muted, and hence the economy has picked up. Now, how do you pick up economy pickup? One is, of course, we wait for quarters and the GDP numbers. We try to put the high frequency data together to say what is happening for energy use, what is happening for tax collections, etc. There are lots of alternative measures which are much more high frequency and real time measures. Google mobility is one of them, meaning what is the footfall in malls? What is the kind of movement you're seeing? And this is highly localized, so you're able to do that for specific localities within cities. So these are truly high frequency and very, very representative. And everybody now has a smart device. So the mobility is picked up on an hourly basis. Against a pandemic, now these I'm just trying to sensitize you to the fact that policy making is also now incorporating new cutting edge real-time data. So, it takes us quarters to put together GDP calculations, etc. But we don't have to necessarily wait for that. There are alternatives to this. When you look at Google mobility data, particularly you compare India with many other countries, the pickup is very strong. We had a slow pickup, but it has been very, very sustained. Second wave was debilitating, but again the pickup was very quick because the second wave was sharp. If you look at different states of the union, then you realize that the states where the pandemic, the virus didn't spread as much, picked up very fast. In fact, the second wave lasted just about a month or so. So the pickup in economic activity was very, very sharp even after the Delta wave. So it is on the back of this kind of movement, number one. Number two, vaccination. Just vaccination becoming almost universal has meant that economies are now, we don't have restrictions. We don't have what are called policies of suppression as far as the virus is concerned. So it's business, open for business. So that's largely, the pandemic story. The second large story which I wanted you to take away, and I feel very passionately about, is the healthcare sector. There are many reasons why we have to bet heavily, and it's not just healthcare from the servicing of care. It is healthcare from the entire gamut of what goes into healthcare. So IT of healthcare, right? The HR of healthcare, the management of healthcare. So there is the entire spectrum that feeds into it. One is the global economy is aging, right? Aging means there is already a rising demand for many different kinds of care, number one. The rich economies are aging very fast, which means the willingness to pay for different kinds of healthcare services is only shooting up. We also know that no country in the world has ever managed to lower their expenditure on healthcare with time. So countries are only going to spend more and more on healthcare. Now, faced with these realities, of course, the rich, the G7s, etc., they have the capability and they are trying to offshore. They're trying to look for cheaper means that they're trying to shift sort of jobs and care beyond their shores. But even an economy like China, whose biggest fear right now from the healthcare perspective is that they are going to grow old before they become rich. China is not a rich country, despite the popular conversations. China, yes, it is 4 times richer than us, but it is a quarter of the Japanese GDP per capita, or if you just consider the rich, again, the OECD countries. So it's not a rich country by any stretch of imagination. But it's a large country which is aging very fast. So their fear is in terms of, again, it's sort of, you have to combine now labor market and health. That their healthcare expenses are rising very fast too, because they have a very fast aging economy thanks to the one-child policy. And of course, they had all kinds of distortions over the last 40, 50 years, and now the chickens are home to roost. So they are also looking to lower their costs. Now, when you have such a large demand for care and a willingness to pay, basically we are saying the global demand for healthcare and different aspects of healthcare are only going to rise. Which are the countries that are going to be able to plug that gap? Very few. Only the ones which truly have demographic on their side. So you need younger. HR is a big concern in healthcare. So of course the human resource part of it, which is why you are seeing there is a great push from the policy side to just push a lot of our youth into either nursing or trying to, the National Medical Commission, in some sense getting rid of a Medical Council of India, or trying to restructure it. One of the big reasons was we have a supply bottleneck and we can't afford to, not just for domestic reason, but also from a global perspective. We need a lot more doctors and nurses, not just to meet our own domestic demand, but also the global demand, right? That's number one. Number two, health IT. For those of you who are familiar with the health IT space, healthcare requires the kind of IT systems and data systems, so management information, HMIS, and beyond, which are very specialized, which means it is not the usual IT and IT solutions which are going to be fitting into that, which means we also have to train and churn out a lot of not just these products, but people who have the skill to provide these services. So again, it's a very fast growing part of it. Then of course the financing aspect of it. From the financing aspect of it, there are lots of new instruments beyond insurance, which the healthcare is now beginning to experiment with. Again, simply because insurance as a financial instrument for healthcare is proving to be unsustainable. You know that the US spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare. It's the largest economy in the world, spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare. And the health outcomes of the US are comparable to Singapore. So similar life expectancy, similar infant mortality, etc., etc. But do you know how much Singapore spends on healthcare? Only 4% of its GDP. So it is not really how much you spend, but the nature of the spending or the instrument through which you spend. Because from fundamental economics, we know that healthcare is not like any other sector. Markets do break down. So you have problems if you remember your, some of the economics, moral hazard and adverse selection type of problems, which means that you need instruments which cannot be insurance alone. Insurance is going to lead to such cost escalation that healthcare becomes unsustainable for any economy. So they're all trying to move away. So Obamacare in some sense is trying to correct the distortion of insurance financed healthcare in the US, right? Of course, strengthening of the public health structure, etc. But that is, every country is trying to do that. So anyway, so strategically, just the fact that the world is positioning, it's almost like stars are aligning and India has to take advantage of that. So you are seeing now healthcare emerge not just because of the pandemic, it is truly becoming a strategic sector for us. We need to be able to get our share of that global pie, which is growing, and we need to be ready for it. That's from the healthcare. The third story I wanted to tell you was something which you read all the time, and yet there is such utter sort of confusion which is a labor market problem. You're always hearing about jobless growth, and you're hearing that India's demographic dividend is very quickly going to lead to demographic disaster because we don't have healthy, smart people, or the youth are not getting jobs and so on. When you look at the research, which will be shared with you, India's labor market is not one labor market. India has 28 vibrant state labor markets. That's the first way to understand it. A lot of policies that feed into job creation are directly state policies. So let's first understand labor problem in India from two metrics. One is something called labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate is what fraction of the working age population, meaning 18 to 59, and of course I'll talk a little bit about 59 is too young, 59 is the new what, 39 today. But the reality is that our labor force participation is, it's peculiarly low. China has had labor force participation rate of around 75% for 30 years going. Vietnam has had labor force participation of more than 70%, meaning 70% of the working age population are either working or looking for work. Bangladesh has labor force participation rate which is now closing 60%. Can anyone guess what our labor force participation rate is? We are around 49%. Very low, which tells you half the population in the working age is neither working nor looking for work. And it is an enigma. What are these people doing? Now, the gender part of it is part of the story. We are the only country where, with economic growth, women's labor force participation is falling. No other country has seen it in the past. And not even extremely hierarchical, conservative economies like Japan, China, South Korea. These are extremely, they have not been gender equal from any perspective, and they all had very low labor force participation rate to start with. But even those places, with economic growth, women have started entering labor force. Not here. In fact, our women's labor force participation has fallen from around 27% to 19% in the last 15 years. Now that, I'm just telling you certain idiosyncrasies of the Indian economy. Structurally, there is something very peculiar here. And researchers, we're trying to, it's like the elephant and six blind men. We're really trying to figure out, ho kya raha hai? Because your policy prescriptions have to then depend on what we understand. And why should India be so peculiar? After all, basic human behavior, we want growth. And when you grow, you want similar set of things. So what is so peculiar? So that is one part of the story. The women's labor force participation. Yes, there's a hand there.
Is it because India is doling out so much of this thing, freebies under the scheme like Manrega and all these things? You go to the villages, why do they need to work? Earlier they were all on the fields. Now they don't need to work, right? They get free rice, they get free distributions on all the, so that is only rising. So that may be one of the reasons.
Let's talk about, that is a very important part of the puzzle, and we'll talk about what schemes like NREGA achieve and what is the true cost of it, which is not limited to the financial cost. Okay, so let's come back to this. The labor force participation story, one is it is an enigma, but let's try to see what does the puzzle of women's labor force participation tell us. And it's an important one. We can't just shrug it away because, it's half your labor force. Women getting educated, yes, we are seeing historical growth in terms of women entering colleges, and every year you read 10th grade they do better, 12th grade they do better, they're entering the colleges and then they're dropping out of the labor force. To ho kya raha hai? Right? There is something very peculiar. Now the research coming out, of course now usually what happens is that you have headlines saying, oh, public transport is not safe. No, public transport today is far safer than it was 20 years back. Public lighting, no, there's far more lighting today than you've had historically. So no, those little things and the sort of the the headline grabbing are mostly wrong. okay, because they are anecdotal and they're not truly. The one part of the puzzle is the story of, the cross wage elasticity. What does that mean? That when income levels have started rising, the one estimate which has been calculated is women's labor force, the supply, has a negative, sort of the cross wage elasticity to the husband's wage. So when the men start earning more and more, the women are dropping out. Acha, that you see in the most affluent sections of the richest economies. That when the husbands become CEO, the wives are sitting back. Because labor supply bends back, remember? After some time, you begin to value leisure. Right? You're willing to pay a price. I mean, you value leisure. You're not going to continue working just because you get paid more. You sit back. But that is a mark of affluence. We are not affluent by any stretch of imagination. At $2,100 per capita per year, we are an economy that has just come out of poverty. So the story that women are sitting back because the husbands are earning more, no, not that much more, right? So then the way the story keeps unfolding is, for traditional society that values children, and we are urbanizing very fast, we are nuclearizing very fast, meaning families are becoming nuclear. And everybody wants children. We have not reached a stage where those choices have become stark. People still want children, by and large. Which means the cost of childbearing and rearing is now entirely borne by the women. Childbearing is very labor intensive. Those of you who have kids, I have 2 boys, hell yes, it's the most labor intensive part of any activity that you ever do. But because you don't have joint families and you don't have institutional childcare support, we're not a country where either the markets, meaning corporations, firms are not providing childcare. The families are increasingly not providing childcare. Well, who's going to take care of the child? So what we think is a choice, the women are choosing to stay back, is almost like, no, it's not a choice, but it is something you got to do. Why? Because you want to have children or you value children. So now that is why you saw the push for maternity policy. But then again, as economists, we have to be, we want more and more things. Yes, we want 6 months maternity leave. But 6-month maternity leave is costly for a firm. And especially again from a developing economy perspective, especially if you're thinking of SMEs, to pay half a year's salary for not getting any work, it's a very progressive thought, but it's a real cost. Phir kya hoga? What's going to be the outcome? And I've seen this, by the way, with our own data of, we are not talking about NREG as women, we are talking about graduates from some of the leading business schools. The women will stay back to take care of kids and so on. The women will take time off, right? Those are just the realities of society and the choices we make. The right decision then is, how much maternity leave can this society afford? So we want to have 6 months and 8 months, and yes, hell, Scandinavia has 3 years. Why don't we have 3 years? You can't afford it. You're a poor country. And you can't entirely privatize the cost by pushing it onto the firms. Because what are the firms going to do? They'll just move away from the women who are of the childbearing age. And yes, that is exactly what they did. So you see, you think you are making a progressive policy. This is where policy making in an emerging market, a developing market like ours, it has to be realistic. It can't be like, Finland does this. No, we're not Finland. Or the US, well, the US, by the way, is the only rich country which doesn't give a single day's paid maternity off, right? So much for progressiveness. But again, reality check has to be there. You can't have policies which are not going to be realistic. And then you're going to blame firms for being discriminating. So that is from the labor force participation rate. It's a sticky story. There's another solution, or seemingly one argument against it, which is when economies are highly formalized. Our economy is still very much informal, meaning a lot of transactions are happening which are not monetized. That's an informal economy. Now, a very simple solution, if you think of, there's me and my neighbor, And suppose I go to my neighbor's house and I cook dinner, and my neighbor comes into my house and cooks dinner, and we basically pay both for the job they do. You'd get the same productivity, but now it is paid. So automatically your GDP is going to rise because you have more monetized productive, what we call activities in the economy. So what I'm getting to is the fact, how are we counting GDP? And the fact that a lot of the activities which are happening in the house, which in a formal economy would be monetized, are still very much informal. So a lot of women's activities are informal and therefore non-monetized. So if you were to monetize these things, meaning you put a shadow price, that is what as economists you do, you put a shadow price to these, you will see that there is a lot more productive activities happening. Now all of you look old enough, I definitely think and I appreciate that running a good household requires a lot of managerial skill and a lot of activities. So then it's about how we measure GDP. So now I'm trying to just sensitize you to how we have to think of women's labor force participation from a traditional institutions, families, childcare, support, etc. What is the role of the firm versus how GDP, etc. So these are two ways in which we can solve this enigma, which is India's labor force participation. The second part of the labor force story is just unemployment rate. So one was labor force participation. Unemployment rate is people looking for job and not getting job. And overall there the Indian unemployment rate is around 6.5%, and that is what it has been. It goes up and down a little bit. But the story really is unfolding at the state level. Beyond the all India level, if you start to look at state stories, then you see that while all India unemployment rate might be 6.5%, you know what is the unemployment rate of Karnataka? It's less than 2%. What is it for Gujarat? Less than 1%. For Chhattisgarh, less than 3%. So states that are growing are creating jobs. Do you know what is the unemployment rate of Kerala, place I grew up? 13%, very close. That is twice the national average. So ho kya raha hai? Now you need to go beyond the all India level when you understand policy, that a lot of job creation, policies that are leading to job creation is what you term broadly as ease of doing business. So states which are business friendly, states that are helping in wealth creation are also job creations. They are leading to job creation. So it's not the role of the government. The governments have never been very good at creating jobs, and they shouldn't be. We don't want them to be. When you see that lakhs of people apply for the job of a clerk in a government office, there's something terribly wrong. It's just telling you the security of a government job, or it's telling you largely what kind of uncertain labor markets we live in, that people value security above productivity. So PhDs, wo peon ke liye they are going. So that's the kind of distortion you're trying to get to. So labor market issues are fundamentally linked to business climate. And in fact, if you correlate the data, then unemployment rates at local level states are very strongly correlated with ease of doing business ranking. States that are improving in one are also improving the other. The labor force story becomes a little more interesting now if you look at age profile. You know what is the unemployment rate of youth, meaning people 18 to 29, versus people 30 years and above? The unemployment rate of the youth is almost 5 times that of people above the age of 30. Globally, the IMF calls this youth inactivity, but it really is a nice sounding word. It's a euphemism for joblessness. You're not working. You're not creating value. That 18 to 29 age group is 5 times more unemployed than 30 plus. So kya ho raha hai? What's happening? Well, clearly by 30 your parents are saying get the hell out. So we can afford to stay back and continue to look for the right job. Why do I say that? Because for the data, and this is all now coming out very clearly in the data, and when you see the slides this will speak to you. If you look at only the youth population now, 18 to 29, and you look at the highly educated, meaning graduate and above degrees, graduate, postgraduate, so on, and you compare their unemployment rate with the youth with primary and below, the highly educated youth are 6 times more unemployed than people who have primary and below. That puts the whole theory of education on its head. We grew up thinking, bhai, let's get an education, we'll get a job. And today, if you have a lot of education, you are likely to be unemployed.
Would that be because, I think when you mentioned about Kerala, which I think is the highest literacy state in India, I think you rightly pointed out, if we don't create an environment of ease of doing business, which Kerala, we can see that the kind of the way the government is functioning, I think this problem would continue. So I think the focus should be both on ensuring the youth gets educated as well as create an environment for entrepreneurs so that the balancing can be achieved.
Let's close the loop. And there is a question. I haven't forgotten you. We'll come to you. Wait. Let me finish the story. And I'll tell you why. Because these guys who have graduate degrees and above are 5-6 times more likely to be unemployed, or they are not taking up a job. Simultaneously, at the same time, when you do industry surveys, industry after industry, survey after survey is telling you today our growth constraint is not finance. It's not capital. We can raise the money. It's skilled manpower. We are just not getting skilled manpower. What do the two things combined tell you? That there is a growing divide between a degree and the skill that the market values. Therefore, the big push for skilling. Now, skill and degree gap also means, and it is directly related to the quality of the education we are imparting. By degree hai, but it's not really worthwhile. The market is not valuing it. Now comes the IT part of it. In IT, that gap can be plugged relatively fast, as we have seen in the last 30 years, meaning IT and the kind of skill that a lot of IT work requires is fairly standardized, meaning you can have a Wipro or an Infosys go into a campus and say, you know what kids, 1,000 of you, I take you back to Mysore, I will train you for 6 months and I will absorb some of you and the rest of you now have the core skill, you can be absorbed in any of these IT firms. But wo 6 months ka cost is borne by the firm. The fact, now 6 months also might be on the downside. Remember, you have to invest a lot in making graduates employable or getting some value out of them. How many industries can afford to pay this cost, compensating for bad quality education and low quality skill? And what is the size of a firm that can possibly do this? Not MSMEs. How much will they train? And train to let you go? Wow. That just doesn't make sense. So you see now what therefore the big push on skilling. Huge push on skilling. That is so skill and gap, right? The industry. The third is we have to manage expectations. In fact, one of the biggest role of leaders in economies, political leaders in particular, or you can think of regulators, is to manage expectations of people. Managing expectation means, boss, you're waiting for this great job, it's just not going to come. Do something. Of course, we also have distorted markets in many areas, including healthcare, that an MBBS alone is not enough to practice. You need a PG degree. A lot of our kids are sitting at home and preparing for next exam. So they're all graduates, not working. So that again is a distortion in the market. Now value trapped in what? We are losing 10 years of work life and productive life because we just haven't got the policies right. So labor market is far more complex. There's a gender story, there's a skill story, there is an expectation story. People are waiting for fantastical jobs.
Could it be also that...
we'll come to you. I need to come to you first. I'll come to you. Yeah.
So I think one question probably got a bit clarified, but I still want to understand a couple of things on the shadow price. Right? That's a very interesting concept because if you really apply that shadow price it's not a new thing that you need to apply it today. You could have applied it even 50 years back. Because there was that kind of economic activity happening which was not measured in that sense. So how would it have looked at that point of time? And versus now, because we are not, simply because we are not valuing it all along. And nobody else does it also. No economy probably does that kind of evaluation. Does it change the entire way people look at the GDP itself? Or does it fundamentally not apply in that sense, and then we can still, it's only a theoretical concept. That's one part.
But I want to stop you there.
Sure.
That is the difference between an organized economy or a highly formalized economy where transactions are monetized versus one where you have informal relationships, so informal contracting. So what the mother is doing in the household is informal contracting. Mother is doing everything. But we are not monetizing it. Now, is it just an accounting issue? When we think of GDP and the shadow price, we are treating it as an accounting issue, which is what I just told you. Ki agar accounting karenge, your GDP will rise because women are doing a lot of work, which in an advanced economy you would pay for. Okay? That's the difference. But as economists, we can be so cut and dry and say that. The sociologists would get very pissed at that. They said, no, when you get paid for an activity, it's also a symbol of how much you value it. So a woman getting paid for a particular service is far more empowered than somebody who's doing all of this for free. So then you get into this whole, this principal agent problem negotiation within the family, intra-household resource allocation, right? And those we can't discount because, we know the reality of our society. We do discriminate against women. So there are realities to that as well. So it is not just an accounting exercise, but the core difference is formal versus informal, organized versus unorganized. Yeah.
When you said that the number of unemployed youth in graduates or graduates and above is much higher compared to the illiterate youth, is it because of the perception built in the society that you're a graduate, you're not supposed to do a work, you should do only work which is, which matches a particular threshold. Yes. Your stature has increased in the society.
Yes,
you're a graduate.
Yes.
You cannot do all this work. So is it because of that?
Yes, a lot of it is. But there is a reality side to it. You might have the degree, but the market is repeatedly telling you, boss, we don't care for this degree. You don't really have a skill. Right? And that is, by the way, it's not a simple thing. It's just telling you we have to completely relook the way we do training, the way we educate our people. Just this, and there many things are wrong with our education system, but one thing we have very right, when we do selection, meaning exams, we do exams very well. Which is why our kids, we might get very bright kids and get them into IITs and the IIMs and engineering college and so on and so forth, not really train them that much because our pedagogy has not changed that much because we're not doing that much research. These kids are just very bright kids.
But do you think the new education policy will tackle that?
That is exactly what we are trying to do. That is what you're trying to do. But you don't really know what will work. So all you're doing in the new education policy is, boss, try anything. Kuch bhi try karo. Ye bhi chalega, wo bhi chalega. The whole idea of specializing from when you are 16 years old makes no sense. So try many things. Or like everybody's coding. Why? Right? But the exam thing is not, and again, a trivial issue. When we know how to pick the smartest kids, they're very sharp in learning on the job. They're really very smart kids. They are not getting the best training in the institution, and that is a pedagogy. That is our problem. As teachers, we have to bring better resources into the classroom. We have to get more research. But the kids are bright because the exams with bronze, they've cracked it. That is why they go on to do so well everywhere. But going on to do everywhere is again very different from entrepreneurial capabilities. And entrepreneurial capability means wo risk-taking appetite hona chahiye. But you're not going to take risk if your uncles and aunts and parents are going to say, degree leke ghar mein, you didn't get a job. Is that why you're doing your own business? Which means as a society, when you said that stature, as a society we have to be totally open to failure. And you know, when I taught at NYU versus when I teach in India in the different business school, there is one core difference. In the CV, the kids out there will very gladly say, I did a startup. I started selling lemonade or coffee and I failed. I mean, I didn't do all that well, I didn't collect. But they're happy of those failures. They are proud of the experience. We in India will think 5 times before we put something which is not perceived as a success. And what is perceived as success is I mean, who knows what is that? Do our parents really know what is success? No. So as a society, so things are changing. I mean, I'm not trying to give you a sense that we are trapped in a mindset. No, things are changing. And it is not changing because there is a great policy effort to change it. But the whole push behind Startup India is that kids just try whatever. I mean, this is like when we were in college 20 years back, the cool kids had a guitar. Today, the cool kid in a college has a startup, has some idea, wants to try something, agtech, fintech, you know, something they want to try. And that is a remarkable change because, you know, they are willing to try, which means they are willing to fail, and we must totally celebrate that because that is where growth is going to come from. Otherwise, we are very good at doing what we are told. Coding kar do, haan kar denge. Manage kar do, haan kar denge. But no, thinking of the problems and thinking of a solution is very different. So entrepreneurial capability means a risk-taking appetite, not fearful of failure. Yeah.
Also, additionally, I'm wondering what is skewing this number is that though whether employable or not, people are going for master degrees, for much more education. So even 23, 24, they are still studying, and since you're taking from 19 to 29 or 18 to 29, isn't this also ending up skewing the numbers that people in the youth who are highly educated are still not employed?
The thing that there is a difference. That is why I made a distinction between labor force participation and unemployment is measured as you're looking for work and not getting it. So when you're in an educational institution, you're not really looking for a job. So there is a way in the data to tell. Yeah.
And also, I think the mindset of respect for every job has to change for the people. I think that is also an aspect in India which is, I think, killing for the lower jobs. Even if I have a skill set to do any job, and if I think that I start comparing with the other people, what would others think? So that respect mindset is itself is a bigger problem.
And I think it is changing, but it's slow. Very slow. But that change is happening, and I think this is where some of the change agents, you know, this one gave up an IT job, this one gave up a Citibank job, went to the village, started organic farming. The reason these stories are coming out is also these are ways in which you break that old mindset that it's okay to grow vegetables and there's a demand for organic. I mean, there is a professional way of looking at it also. The willingness to pay or just the price that organic demands is so much more. Yeah.
Ma'am, can this whole concept of respect be changed by awarding degrees even for vocational courses? Because you yourself now mentioned degrees a couple of times, right? So we as a society are always looking for degrees.
Yeah.
Now, a BSc degree is not probably as job attractive as, let's say, carpentry. But still people aspire to do a BSc degree or a BA degree, you know, even though they could earn more as a carpenter. So can we give out like all ITIs as degrees instead of calling them polytechnics? Can we give out degrees at something on farmer level, at all the vocational jobs? Would that solve this problem?
There is definitely a major push to go towards that side. So skilling is now, we are thinking, how do we certify it? So certification is the natural second stage of just starting all these skilling activities. From certification, then you go to different forms of certification, and degree is one of them.
That's why one of the Odisha state and one of the first states to start skill development minister. Sunil Baji has been appointed as the skill development minister. I think in connection to what he said.
So ma'am, I have a point here. You spoke about policies, so this is all about Skill India. My point to you is, you said about various maternity leave or creche, or government does a lot of these incentives to promote a lot of things.
Yes.
And you mentioned that policies and businesses have to talk. I mean, I'm sure they're thinking on a large scale. Some of the sessions we attend, all the ministry, they are I mean, they know a lot of things, much more than probably we heard them in the past. So I mean, are they not able to see all this or know all this, what you're saying? So they're surely doing things. And you said that we are not a Finland, I agree. But somewhere we have to make a beginning, isn't it?
Yeah.
So which means they're doing. And you spoke about that youth where we don't. But you see the education. A doctor is 29 by the time they complete their complete education, right? When will they? After that, they start earning. But then they earn till 80.
Yeah.
It's not that they stop earning. So
Sure.
how do they all get factored? Because is it right to say that in India, the education is like that. You can't help it. So, is it the right way of measuring?
You know, the point, I think the best point you made was regard to we have to make a beginning. Okay, there is a cost. We understand, but we have to make a beginning. And there I want to link it to the question asked on NREGS. The NREGS question is a very important one. NREGS, you all appreciate that the immediate impact, despite all the berating and the politics, let's put that out of the window, who started and why and so on. NREGS has led to reduction in poverty, yes. This is unequivocal. The data has repeatedly told us that NREGS has had some fundamental impact on the Indian economy. One is it has elevated poverty, meaning more people are, poverty measured as consumption, okay. So, per capita monthly consumption expenditure, meaning how much people are consuming, if we look at that as a measure, we are less poor today thanks to NREGS, number one. Number two, it's a relief. I mean, during pandemic, I mean, now you know what happened after Corona. One of the best welfare relief measure we had was NREGA. So almost every state activated and ramped up its NREGS, etc. But it is not such a simple story. There is a true cost to it. What is the cost? The cost is, and this we did and we learned through a series of what are called randomized controlled experiments, which means these are highly scientific and rigorous way of studying impact of something on the ground. What did NREGS achieve? Well, you know, globally, poverty is a problem, poverty alleviation is a concern for the World Bank and a lot of multilateral institutions, etc. So, there was a belief 20 years back, and this was a major belief because experiments were run, similar experiments, in more than 10 countries simultaneously. The idea was, perhaps we can transform very poor people into micro-entrepreneurs. What does that mean? That these are not people above poverty line whom we call economically active poor. Ki bhai, theek hai, you have a small parchun shop, or you run, you know, a little cobbler who probably shines 20 shoes over. Or a weaving basket, maybe 50 baskets. So these are micro enterprises, you're economically active. For that segment, access to finance is a huge impediment. So microfinance took off. So you started giving out a lot of micro loans and so on. But poverty is not about that segment. Poverty is about destitutes, people below who are not economically active, meaning there's no cash flow. Okay. Now to that segment, the belief was, let's give them one major asset as a transfer. Instead of giving them free electricity, free whatever for 40 years, let's give them a sizable transfer and train them and let us see if they can become entrepreneurs. Okay? So appreciate the idea. That is very appealing. That is why the World Bank spent hundreds of millions of dollars in replicating this in 10 countries simultaneously. We did the evaluation of the largest of that in India. And this was run in Medak and Mehbubnagar district of then Andhra Pradesh, later Telangana. What do we find? Now globally people are finding great results. In fact, New York Times, and by the way, this was called Ultra Poor Program, or what is also, if you read New York Times regularly, which I now hope you don't, but 10 years back it used to be a little better. It used to be called the Chickens Program, meaning very poor people, give them an asset, meaning a cow, set of chickens, some goats, and they'll begin to take care of these enterprises because there's a direct cash flow out of these. It's not like you have to wait 10 years, right? You can sell the milk, you can sell the meat, you can sell the chicken, whatever. A lot of people chose small kirana stores. Telephone booth was another. So these are all in the range of 50,000 rupee fixed cost and then basic financial training. And then let us see if they can manage because cash flow hai. There is a direct immediate cash flow that comes. So it's a very appealing idea. And in 9 out of 10 countries, people found impact. Ki haan, ultra poor are actually becoming entrepreneurial. Most people are successfully doing. It's like teaching people to fish instead of giving them the darn fish. Yes. It failed in India. Why? And it failed in Andhra Pradesh in India. It didn't fail in West Bengal. And Abhijit Banerjee, who got the Nobel last year, he was my mentor, he found great impact. West Bengal mein see it's working very well. I didn't find an impact. So I was terribly, and we had a meeting in Paris and they said, well, you probably did the study badly. That is the easiest thing to blame. I said, the data is all out there. Then we went back into the data and we kept looking at, by result, why is it 0? And it turned out to be, I think, the most intuitive and insightful of the studies I have ever done. And it is now one of the most cited. From the year 2006 to 10 was the time when NREGA was getting implemented. NREGA came into existence from 2006. You know the state which implemented it the best? Andhra. Andhra implemented NREGAs like nobody else. Every state used to send their secretaries in rural development, etc., to go learn from Andhra. But what are they doing so well? They had a smart card before the rest of us had Aadhaar. TCS was doing their back-end entire IT support and the kind of training, etc. Okay. But no impact for the ultra-poor program. When you look at the data, what do you find? That all these households, and this was running over 1,200 villages, so this is a very large experiment we ran. The reason you don't find an impact is because at the same time that now they are taking care of chickens and kirana and cows and buffaloes, the outside opportunity of doing all this is rising rural wages. NREGS led to 40% real increase in rural wages in Andhra Pradesh from 2006 to 9. Because NREGA worked like minimum wage guarantee. So your rural, it's a lifting of the tide, people. Every other job in rural areas now has to match the NREGS jobs. But what happens when the tide is lifting? You really get to know who's swimming naked. When it goes down, you know who's out of breath. Many small and micro enterprises who had significant labor component, they became unsustainable because the labor costs rose too much. So the comment you heard, yes, labor cost became too much for many micro enterprises. So many businesses shut down. Many farmers said, look, I'm going to leave, I'm not going to harvest because I just can't afford labor. Let it rot. It just didn't make sense. Now do you realize the opportunity cost of alleviating poverty, which is a purely distribution scheme, we were giving cash in the hands of the rural poor, was giving up some amount of growth. Because however small an enterprise, it is value creation. It is growth. This is how growth is not Ambani's and Adani's, as the newspapers would have. Growth is every business which is generating some value is adding to economic growth of the country. And many of our micro businesses went under because labor cost is unsustainable. This was the time in India when you saw a great casualization. If you look at the NSS data, we had the biggest increase in casual labor and a decline in self-employment. This was the phase from 2006 to 10. So self-employment came down, casual labor went up. Why? Because labor wages are rising. People would much rather do casual labor than be self-employed and do these small businesses. So I want you to appreciate the fact that the answers are never simple. And that is fundamentally our job. Our job is to tell the policy makers that this is the real cost. Ki poverty alleviate hoga, but you are going to lose growth. Now, you saw firsthand the trade-off between growth and equity. Distribution we want. We want to lower poverty. We want to give cash in the hands of people. The price we paid is growth. Now, while we know the positive side of NREGS, we have almost never discussed the growth we have given up. And it's not easy for small businesses to pay such high wages. It's just not sustainable. Again, we are talking about progressive economies, progressive ideas having true cost. Japan initiated and implemented minimum wages After 100 years of economic growth, we implemented minimum wages in the 1960s when we had what growth? So we have, just as a population, as people, we are very romantic, right? And by the way, it is not because our policymakers have not had good advice. In fact, if you read the archives, Mahalanobis often warned Nehru that minimum wage nature, we're not there yet. But policies go through. I mean, there is politics, and the dance of democracy often is at odds with what is pragmatic economic decision making. We see this all the time, right?
I've just got a point of interjection for this particular.
Yes, please.
Why there is a trade-off between poverty elevation to growth. There is also an impact of exploitation of the poor.
Yes.
That has a much bigger impact on their growth. And we often discount it because what happened with respect to the entire, the red belt, because of the Naxalism or whatever left-wing, extreme left-wing movement that is there, we've still not been able to see the growth out over there. So for somewhere would the equity distribution today, while there is going to be a temporary blip in the growth, would eventually lead to growth over a medium to long term horizon? I mean, is there something that you've seen from your studies or research or what?
That's an excellent question. It also tells you that in a democracy, boss, everybody has a vote. And the reason you are often, and in India you realize why so many of our policy making is heavily biased in favor of rural policies, is because a very large number of our poor and rural areas vote a lot. Cities are not that politically responsible, I think. So policymakers have to, I mean, this is democracy, and I think it's totally fair, because what is the role of a political leader? He has to or she has to represent the preferences of their constituents. And if the poor are their constituents, we are going to see farm loan waivers, whether you like it or not, we are going to see. And a lot of these decisions are not bad decisions, but at the end it's about what is the cost of it and what is the real cost of it. Now the exploitation bit, and that we have paid, it is a much worse problem to me. To me, there is a theoretical side of all of this, but to me what is always appealing is if it's an empirical issue. Can you measure it and tell me what is the real cost? Because otherwise it is your theory versus my theory. So we have to be willing to measure it. The one thing which we now have proved is that despite fighting extremism and Naxalism and that entire corridor, and there was a time when 30% of our districts, 30%, 1/3 of the country was afflicted. The best way to fight those ideologies is economic growth. And how does economic growth happen? For the government to make it happen, the best facilitating role it has is invest in infrastructure. By the way, infrastructure is not just hard infrastructure, health and education. Because equality and opportunity, boss, wahi se aata hai. It comes from health and education. Otherwise, you're going to, continue this great divide, right? A lot of us are in this room not because we are smart or we have earned many things. A lot of it is because we just won the lottery and we were born in the right family. And that is what you want to undo when you think of democracies and policy making, right? So, absolutely, I completely agree with you. Yes.
More of a question with respect to healthcare and what happened after COVID, especially with relation to reverse migration.
Yeah.
There was a whole lot of people that, and even in healthcare when I was working as a software developer, we got very excited because no private healthcare enterprises have ever made money when they went into tier 2, tier 3 and beyond. Right? So this reverse migration got us very excited. So just wanted your thoughts on what is happening today, from your comment on 40 convention Bangalore. Seems like all of them actually come back. So do you see that in your studies? Is the government doing anything with respect to healthcare in these places now that they have, if there is true and if it's sticking on? Is there any action being taken from a healthcare standpoint in creating the ecosystem?
You have to look at the states. Because a lot of action, not every state suffered equally. And one state that I'm working very closely with is one of the, in terms of the metrics of, outcome metrics of healthcare, it often is in the bottom 5. It is one of our poorest states, it's Madhya Pradesh. You know, Madhya Pradesh has seen a 33% increase in its health budget. And largely on account of the fact that despite being a very poor state, it was always in the top 4 as far as the vaccination drive was concerned. So it's almost like a positive reinforcement that when they said, ki boss, ye to karna hai, they mobilized civil society, they mobilized every rung of government, all the way to the panchayat and below, in making vaccines possible, right? And once they saw this success, now the fact that they have very high neonatal mortality or very high infant mortality or malnutrition is one of the worst. Now the whole effort is how do you channel this existing network into achieving those goals now. So the first thing they did was budget badhana hai. So budget is not going to be a constraint. In fact, so much so that the High Court there has also told them, look, there are lots of restrictions to recruitments. Recruitment, by the way, when you say there is shortage of doctors and nurses, etc., it is not often that it's not available. A lot many times you have just stickiness in the system. You can't recruit anymore till you have met, let's say, the SC/ST quota. So as I said, there are these. So the High Court has basically said, no, the problem is too big, go ahead and recruit. We'll figure something about meeting the quota, but in the meantime, let it not stop your recruitment drive. So you see this kind of flexibility and agility in a public system, for me it is new. And I think it's good, but not every state is doing the same thing, right? Now the reverse migration was a huge problem in the first 2 quarters of the pandemic. And most people have then, of course, come back. States have approached this problem very differently. UP approached it. UP now is the first state which basically said, okay, all these guys have come back. Okay, first thing they did was ramped up NREGs. But they also realized this is not the solution. So they have now got a registry of skills. Okay, what did these guys do wherever they were? So they are now in their large growth plan, they are now trying to see what belts, what kind of skills exist. So now they're trying to think of there is this grand sort of aspiration to become 1 trillion economy in a certain time frame. They're looking at what do you do to agro processing, what do you do to local industries. There aren't that many, but UP has a game plan and they are looking at the reverse migrants as being a very critical part of that strategy. But again, like I said, not every state is approaching it similarly. And on the healthcare count, different states have responded differently, but almost every state today has made enough public health investment in infrastructure that a lot many new things can be mounted. I think now the market solution part of it, I think it's about now going, and using this fixed cost which the government has borne and making it valuable. You bring a real value to the market now. So this is a good time for health tech. This is a good time for ag tech even, just because there is a great degree of openness amongst the states. So I think Delhi is not the place you don't want to talk to Delhi people. You want to talk to state people. States are hungry. Okay, let's ask somebody who's never asked.
I'll request Murali to take over and structure the questions from everybody so that all of us get a chance to interact with you. Mr. Murali is the CFO of IKEA. He will help us moderate now.
It's very heartening to see the amount of questions and the engagement. Maybe we start with the questions and then we'll try to.
So you kept talking about skill as a very important aspect of how we create employment. Can you break it down to understand how is the government looking at skill? It has many facets to it. Soft skill is one of them. And there are multiple other aspects. How do you kind of break it down to see what does it really mean when it gets delivered as a certification or a form?
Soft skill is really the lower priority right now. I think soft skills are where a lot of the higher ed, not just higher ed, but generally more higher ed institutions, the new education policy, etc., are trying to address. Communication is a very fundamental part of school education also. We never talked about communication strategy. Now kids are having classes within their curriculum. Skilling is more about core hard skills, meaning something that can be tested and certified. Now the testing is still not happening, But the certification, one believes, is ready to happen. But one thing you have to understand is that the usual mindset, and this is where I'm usually a bit skeptical, that the government should be doing a lot of this. I don't think government should be. Because first, the sense that we have this knowledge, ki gap kya hai? Do we need drivers? Do we need carpenters? Do we need masons? What do we need? That, I think, let the market decide. So we have to have categories within which a lot of these skills has to be imparted. It also has to be done sustainably. Meaning if which is what the government has been doing, right? It has been financing, it has been giving a lot of money to people to skill people. But we have not yet, not once measured how many of them got employed. So this is one of the first queries when I heard the representation from, let's say, the Skill Development Ministry, when they said we have spent so much money, we have skilled so many people, but you have to change the way you think of policy. That is just spending money, or I can spend a lot of money. That's not an outcome. The outcome is that how many of them eventually got the job. So let's start at least measuring outcomes instead of simple inputs and outputs. So certification then is almost like an output right now. Really getting the job at the end of the day becomes a measure of outcome.
Yeah. Referring to my previous comments were about literacy and the ease of doing business. So the unemployment is basically the demand and supply gap. The market has some demand, the supply is totally different. So how is government aligning the education policy, the industrial policy, and the labor, so that you know that there are so many people who are getting educated but not getting employed, because there is not enough trust for that category of the industry that needs to be promoted vis-a-vis the education policy and the labor. So what kind of these three ministries are working in sync so that we address the unemployment issue?
Short answer is no. I doubt if there are any schemes, and despite, I think there is recognition right from the top that convergence, by the way, is the word people use in the government. Convergence nahi hai. But convergence kaise hoga? Who wants convergence? What is an outcome of convergence? So you see, again, it's like when you run a firm, you would like all your CXOs to run things seamlessly and talk to each other, but it never happens. So it has to be institutionalized in a way that the top guy has a good sense of, well, these are the deliverables and this is the timeline. And boss, this is your responsibility, this is yours and this is yours. Right now I think there is much more conversation happening today than perhaps it was in the future, but not anywhere near how much we're doing. Now, another missing piece in this puzzle is industry representation. Let me assure you, government, and by that I mean bureaucracy, very smart people, but there's no obvious reason why they should care so much for it. We have to be very pragmatic when we think about government like that. That they are very high performing, there are people who want to make a change, but let's assume they are the rare people in the system. The average person is doing a normal job and has no obvious incentive to do a stellar job or not, right? So there's no, so the incentive compatibility, the constraints which you optimize, that is not happening here. So it becomes, and that is where I think industry representation is a very, very weak spot in our policy making. And during pandemic, it became very clear because the government was like listening. I was invited to several of these meetings where industries were making representations and the ministers of different ministries were listening and they wanted to do things. But the industry representation almost always was very self-serving to the extent it is serving to the guy making the presentation, not even the industry that he or she represents. So you see, it is not very professional. You have to understand that firms making representation is very different from industry making representation. There are going to be costs for a firm which are personal cost of the firm. Then there are certain coordination problems which only industry level can be solved. Individually, it is too costly for you to solve. For instance, just doing regular, let's say, quarterly report on demand supply. Which firms can do that? None of you. It's too costly to do this kind of survey for each individual firm. But industry should be doing it, which means you can pool your resources and make a case, but you make a consolidated case to the government. And I think we have to get better at that. Industry reps should be better. I think NASSCOM is doing perhaps the best job of all the industry associations today, and that is because the sector is far better organized as well. So it feeds both ways.
So, I mean, we'll take one question and I'll let ma'am finish if you finished the storytelling, because, you know, we have deviated a bit. I mean, it's heartening to see the engagement, but maybe you want to finish this story.
I have one more story.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, ask your perspective on, you spoke about ease of doing business and how each state is driving their own agenda. But I was wondering, at what stage do you believe ESG is going to become an important component of decision making, both at a country level and at a central level? And how do you factor in that cost? And how are you thinking about that? Because it's going to be reality.
There are two ways of thinking of it, I think. You see, what makes life a little difficult to push, I teach microfinance, I teach impact investing, and I've done this for the last 20 years because I fundamentally believe there is a market. There is a gap, and ESG, what we call ESG today, but impact investing for a long time, has a role and can meet that. In fact, we had a committee, I was part of that, I was a member of that, at SEBI, which we have a social stock exchange. And the whole idea is that we make it possible to raise money for social causes, but you are basically going to use it through market, let's say, instruments, right? So how you deploy them is up to the firm, whatever you want to do. It could be just delivering services directly, education, health, whatever, or you could finance it. But either ways, you are able to raise money through this social stock exchange, right? I mean, so there isn't a stock which is getting traded. So in that sense, it's not a regular stock exchange, but the social stock exchange becomes more of a filtering mechanism, some kind of a credibility driving so on. So there is some movement, there is a sense of, yes, something needs to be done. One clear way where I think for us, for India, I mean, it is an opportunity is because the climate issue. I think not just Prime Minister Modi, but I think there is one is just the way of life. I think we like recycling. We're not huge consumers. I mean, the way Americans consume, or again, many of the OECD markets, we are not typically like that. So when he talks about behavioral change and all of those things, it sticks. People sort of appreciate some of these things. But unlike, let's say, Germany and elsewhere, when you're doing a market survey, you're trying to say the youth wants change, but by and large, no. I don't want to cut down on consumption of petrol. I don't want to. So behavioral change is very difficult to do in many of the rich countries. Here, it's moving much faster, right? And the PM keeps talking about behavioral change. But that apart, we know that if we really want to move towards renewables, we want to turn towards green investments, we have the market for it, we have the demand for it. Where's the money going to come from? Which means, and by the way, recently in Germany, we got a promise of 10 billion euros or something. In his outreach, there is an effort to raise money for this green transition. The world is not going to make a green transition till India makes. India is a very large part of the global solution, right? But we need money. And the rich countries have not been forthcoming in terms of making a lot of this transition happen. Now, it is not that they're not forthcoming willingly. Some of it is also, perhaps there is willingness to it, but some of it is also that the instrument, we have not yet designed the instrument in what form. What is it that we should be raising money for exactly? So again, designing instruments. So we're thinking of green bonds, we're thinking of many things, perhaps even investing a great deal in wind energy. Yes, money has begun to come in. A lot of this can be from the ESG perspective, but what is making life a little difficult from the ESG, from the global ESG sector, is the fact I think the Americans don't fundamentally believe in it. The Europeans to some extent do. I don't think the Americans believe in it because there is often a pushback against a lot of ESG talk saying, no, but it comes in the way of our fiduciary duty. So if you're asking me to go green, which means ESG, which means take a cut, but do greener, do the right thing, but obviously it's going to give you a slightly lower return. That's the cost you're going to pay. and you should be okay with it. In the US, I've sensed a lot of pushback against ESG. Europe has been more accommodating and willing to experiment. Now, these global differences also mean that in India, we are looking at, who's going to invest? Who's going to put in money in some of our things? So far, I think Europe is a better bet for us. But definitely, there is a large conversation happening around this, and particularly the climate part of it.
Okay, ma'am. We can
The last story?
Yes.
Let me make it very quickly. This is the narrative economics, and the only reason I want to sensitize you to this is we are all living in it. If you look at the GDELT data, what is GDELT data? It is Google data again. But what Google does is, global media, meaning more than 100 languages, you start looking at how are global media, meaning 100 languages, meaning many, many, many countries. How are they covering different countries? This is called media tone. We measure it as media tone. And now natural language processing allows you to string words together to see whether it is a positive tone or a negative tone and what is the nature, meaning what is the magnitude of that positive and negative. So natural language processing allows you to do this. So we've given different media tone, positive, negative, so on. Now, typically media has bad news. So the coverage is traditionally negative, and frankly, that is normal. That is what we appreciate because that is the job of the media. Except when you begin to look at the data from the beginning of the pandemic, meaning January or February 2020, what you're seeing is almost it's not just India. First, I looked for India very naturally, that India coverage is getting worse and worse. So yes, India's coverage is getting pretty bad. Then I said, let's look at a large federal democracy like ours, noisy, protesting all the time. US actually sometimes during Trump's time looked much worse. But again, very bad coverage. I said, how about good democracies like Sweden or Germany? They are also getting very negative coverage. So that sounds like that is fine. All is well with the world. Media is doing its job. And then you study China. China started out where everybody else started out. And something happened around Feb of 2020. From negative, they've gone to positive, to only more positive. It's remarkable that global media coverage of a country is glowing in the midst of a pandemic, which not only emerged there, but actively you are seeing the WHO completely toothless against this entity. Also the trade war. You're seeing China's role vis-a-vis, then of course, Doklam happened, and then what Ladakh happened, and China's coverage in global media is getting better and better and better. That includes a lot of Indian media too. So there is frustration in India that a lot of our media houses are sold to the Chinese, yes. But you know what? A lot of global media houses are sold to the Chinese. Why does that matter? And why am I telling you this story? Traditionally in corporate finance, narrative economics is when you studied when do firms make stories go viral? Firms plant stories. And a lot of information economics learns a lot from neurosciences, right? The neural movements, the way your brain processes information, is also the way information moves in society. So there is a lot of theorizing from there. But we are beginning to see that what firms have traditionally done to help them, raise stock value or crash somebody else's stock value by planting stories and making them go viral, now it is very much a part of policy making. It was not like the game, the nature of the game is changing. So narratives are being set. Is this a futile, is this just an academic exercise? Everybody, okay, China has all the media in its pocket. It's paying people off. Yeah, does it matter? Actually, it matters. In what form? One, it affects investment decisions. So every time you say, oh, India is getting more intolerant, there is divisiveness in India, India is very violent. Yes, it does affect investment decisions, number one. Number two, it also affects when you sit at the negotiating table, when a country raises human rights concerns about you. And international relations, negotiations happen on many, it's a vector of different things that you negotiate against. So democracies like ours, because we do have free press, and thank God for that, and of course there is capture of all type, but largely we have free press. But countries, and namely China, is leading the way. Now we can all be worried about it. Okay, what do you believe then? When you pick up a newspaper, what's credible? I'm linking it to the whole fake stories and fake narratives, and we don't know what to believe anymore. And I'm just telling you, yes, unfortunately, we are getting into a realm of policy making where you can't just pick up something and read and believe it to be credible. The scrutiny has to be much deeper because it is managed. It is being managed very actively with a lot of resources globally. So it is affecting a lot of our negotiating. We are faced with a lot of challenges as a country because also we don't have the means. Not only are we not putting resources into such things, but we just don't have the skills and the capabilities to be able to contest a lot of these narratives. Okay, so that whole quip on New York Times was, really meant to sensitize you that when you pick up a newspaper and you see that things are getting bad in India, I wanted to show you some data, and you will see in the slides what has happened to basic quality of life, the way the human development indicators are improving. We are 25 years behind China on per capita GDP. Yes, economically they've just taken off. But human development indicator, we are 10 years behind, which means that development-wise we're actually not so bad, or which means they are screwing up much more. They should have done better for their level of economy, right? That's one. Number two, just look at, if you think of violence and India getting divisive, look at metrics. So riots, I begin to study riots. Riot is it's a variable which is very well defined. Riot is a violent episode involving more than 5 people to a common purpose. That's a riot. And when you look at riots, in late 80s, India was having more than 1 lakh riots a year. Yes, India has been very violent in the past. It is getting only better. There was a structural break in the 90s. So with economic reforms and economic growth, you have also seen rioting come down very drastically. So not just at the national level, at the state level, at district level. You look at rapes or crime against women, there is a structural break in the data. Look at state by state. Something happened around 13, 14, 15. India is seeing a structural break-in, right? So on many counts, things are getting better. Look at connectivity, the jam trinity. More than 95% households in every district of the country has a bank account, Aadhaar, and mobile. My God, it's a platform on which you don't just mount welfare programs. Lots of market solutions are going to be and have been. Now, the Supreme Court rightfully has put restrictions, but those are right restrictions, and consent and all of those architectures are important. But you have an architecture on which a lot of things can be mounted. So agtech, fintech, mobile banking, a lot of these things are possible only because 95% households have. We have 1.2 billion phone subscribers. Now think of the magnitude. So there's a reason we are so bullish on India is because our fundamentals are very strong. So when you pick up a newspaper and you think, oh, all hell is breaking loose, you just have to put it away and think from a slightly longer term perspective. Your trends are all in the right direction. But a lot of the game is played in the mind. Whether you invest or you're scared is whether you fundamentally believe whether things are going to get better or worse. And I, for once, when I look at the data, and I don't look at the data at the all India level, I always look at states, preferably, and lately I've been looking at district levels. We are in a very solid position. So a lot of these investments, a lot of these new growth decisions, etc., are all, time is now, right? So that was the resurgent and the path ahead, and yeah, I just wanted to tie it up with the rest. That was my final story.
Thank you, ma'am. Fascinating evening, and great way to tie the whole thing up, right from starting from the post-pandemic to the post-pandemic, and then what lies ahead for us. I guess the stomachs are rumbling. The snacks have got repeated. How much time do we have? Do we have time for 5 minutes? 5-10 minutes. So any more questions? And do you have still?
Everybody was not raised a question.
Yeah. So I was waiting. Sorry, I don't know your name, but.
Why don't we collect 2, 3?
Yeah.
Hai na?
So maybe on that table we start from there.
So you spoke about minimum wages and the impact of the minimum wages on the businesses, and we spoke of NREGA being implemented and the cost of NREGA. So what the next thing is the labor code, will it have an impact? And how will it impact?
The short answer is yes. It's already begun to impact. Not every state has implemented, not right, but states like UP, MP, I think Rajasthan, they have already, the 4 codes, the core 4 codes that were to be revoked, they have. And you have not seen a major pushback. It's not like the labor unions or the trade unions are pushing back against it. And those are all good signs, right? So sometimes, and this ties up with the farm laws as well, that the farm laws for 40 years, whether you are an economist on the right or the left, by the way, there's no left and right in India. That is the politics and the sociology and whatever. In economics, it's left and more left, right? There are too many people who speak for private enterprise. And yet, I mean, if we are honest to ourselves, what really changed in 91? What changed since 2000? It's private enterprise. You go to Nubra Valley, you go to Andaman Nicobar, you go to Kutch, go to Nagaland, your remote parts of the country. You have telephony, you have food delivery, you will get your gutka, you will get your coke, you will get your milk, all on the back of private enterprise, right? And which is why I try to motivate policy by saying, look, if coke is sold in the remotest part and gutka can be sold in the remotest part, there's no reason why I believe public services can't be. The logistics are there, we just have to do it right. Somebody
Absolutely.
at the back, I think there's someone.
Oh,
yeah.
I just wanted to say that there is a resurgent India story because of the pandemic. The pandemic has broken work from home and connectivity, and therefore it behoves the corporates, as you say, to go to now all of the cities, tier 2, tier 3, including villages such as IIM, where our workforce has gone, and therefore there will be, I believe, next revolution even in IT. Excellent. And it is on us to now skill people up without degrees, because our education system is just simply.
Very well said.
Absolutely. Yes, the gentleman.
Thank you so much for your insightful session. With respect to labor force, so there are a lot of companies employ gig workers directly. Sorry. So, wanted to understand, do your study or the government look upon this employment of gig workers as solving an employment problem, or how is it being looked upon? Although we see government is taking a lot of initiatives in including in labor codes, and a lot of discussions do happen. Just wanted to understand.
You know why the PLFS was rolled out, the Periodic Labor Force Survey? Exactly because of the gig. Like food delivery, let's say, has been one of our biggest employers. Not just the cabs, the aggregators, etc., but there are many service deliveries which are employing people by hundreds of thousands, right? And the fact that we were missing those when we did the usual NSS employment unemployment surveys, which is why the entire system of collecting data and measuring employment needed to be overhauled, and the gig economy was the motivation of that. So people are, I mean, very, very pragmatic. We completely understand that the nature of the economy is changing, so the nature of policy making has to change. The nature of data collection has to change. The problems in gig, those standard problems will remain. Ki bhai employee ho ki entrepreneur ho, should we give benefit? Yes, but those are concerns which every economy will have to, but that's a different issue. I think the recognition that it's a major, major source of employment is very well appreciated.
Just a question, slightly controversial. Global inflation is it real or is it a narrative economy?
From the way the central banks are responding, it seems pretty real, no?
That doesn't answer the question.
Oh, look, I know I don't have a crystal ball. All I can sense is there is something systematically happening. No, the one thing which I didn't have in the slides, but we have to, when we say Atmanirbhar Bharat, yes, the global economy is beginning to look inwards. We have gained a lot from globalization. So the rich countries, the Western Europeans and the Americans can have huge revolutions and movements against globalization. Trump was or many of the right-wing parties that have come into power have been on the back of the fact that there is a pushback, right? There are distribution effects. Not for us. We have gained, just like China, we have gained tremendously from globalization. We like those things. But the pandemic has told us that, boss, you also need to be self-reliant on certain strategic sectors. So even in terms of the pharma, the API, the dependence on China is so high. And the fact that at strategic times, inputs have not been forthcoming. So this great push, which anyway, there was this thought that we have to do many things. From China, if you just look at the kind of things we import, and this made for an excellent report, when you start reading, sofas, cane furniture, these are not high tech. Why can't we build them here? Right? Now, this is where again you have to take a longer term view of economic growth rather than what is today the most efficient. As economists, we typically very myopic, saying quarter to quarter. So we're saying, abhi to it is very low cost, let's just get the input and we'll get things done. But the high cost and opportunity cost in the long term is that what are you producing on your own? Look at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is teaching us a big lesson that you can't be so over-dependent on one sector and that too foreign money. And of course, the Chinese played a big role and mischief, and we saw that unfolding, and corruption, of course, made everything worse. But those are stories that can unfold everywhere. So I think the big push for Atmanirbhar, Make in India, the defense, by the way, this is the first time our exports in defense have risen. We are actually signing deals and exporting defense equipments to other Asian countries and African countries. And these are remarkable. These are not high-end things, but these are good. These are beginnings, and they required a change in mindset. Now, the problem strategically is energy cost. 33% of our total energy consumption or demand is imported. Our over-dependence on imports is our weakness right now. By the way, the US had the same problem, but they recognized it. So 2009-10 is when they began to reverse the trend. And now they are down to 15%. The Chinese have also started to reverse it. So countries recognize that, and you see what is happening with Europe. Since you asked about the war, a lot of it right now is linked with energy prices. Because the over-dependent on Russian fuel, gas, has meant that despite all the posturing, the Europeans are not, and Germans. Today we are faced for the first time with the reality that perhaps German manufacturing, for the first time since World War II, is actually going to be faced with a slowdown, perhaps a shutdown, on account of the fact that they are so dependent on Russian oil. And it's not easy to, because they just shut down their nuclear. That again a reality check. It's good to be, but don't be blindly progressive. Kya hota hai? Nuclear is bad. Oh my God. Is coal better? They shut down the nuclear reactors first because they wanted to go green and do all the right things, what we call woke things today. And against the war, what are they doing to decouple themselves from Russia? They're fueling all their coal plants. There goes all your green, whatever commitments through the window. Right? So we have, that's what I'm saying, progressive sounding policies are not necessarily smart policies.
I know the excitement is still pretty high.
Last one.
Last one more question, and then we stop. Yes,
Thank you. I think perfect for the last question, maybe. In your opinion, do you think India will get rich before it gets old?
I like to believe yes, but no, come on, we have to be realistic. Rich is a long way for us. Our bigger problem is that we are young, but we are growing old very fast. And in that sense, you have to realize it's very much similar to the Chinese problem. Of course, one child made things worse, but the way you have to think of it is when the dependent population gets very large, meaning old people are growing in numbers, and of course kids don't work, how will the working age, which is shrinking, how will it sustain this large, old, dependent population? Who's going to finance it? We are not Canada that can say visa to all, IT guys. They're getting, where consulates, where have they opened? The Canadians in Tel Aviv, Bangalore. They want young, smart, productive people to come and pay for their senior citizens and future and growth and whatever. And that's a perfectly fine, that you see value, so you go. The point is, who's going to come? It's us. We have to do it. Therefore, the job scene becomes important. Therefore, productivity important. Now, the Japanese have a very, very fascinating way of looking at aging. Since we started with aging, let's end with aging. The Japanese are saying there's a distinction between biological age and chronological age. Meaning a 70-year-old is as productive as a 50-year-old. So aging should not be viewed from the chronology or the chronological age. View it from a productivity age. To me, it sounds, yes, but it's a marginal adjustment. Because the Japanese are facing the worst problem with labor shrinkage, the population shrinkage, right? I think by 2030, it is estimated their population will be the same as it was during First World War. So they are shrinking very fast. So who's going to pay for it? And they're not the Canadians, they're not the Americans, they're not open to labor market mobility, they're not open to migrants. And a lot of our negotiations on multilaterals, and RCEP is one, is that, boss, let's not just negotiate trade deals for commodity, for manufacturing, products and services. Let's think of labor. Labor ko dalo, because labor is one of our biggest assets. But we just have to make a better job. We have to negotiate better for our people so that they're not just cheap labor fueling growth elsewhere. We get the right value for it.
Great. I have seen software engineers work out of remote corners of Nagaland. There is hope and there is resurgence. Thank you for the fascinating discourse today, and I'm sure there's still questions and we still have dinner waiting. So I'll hand over to Rajesh and the WMG team to take over.